You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Often, in the paranormal, certain words and terms become loaded with potential emotional baggage. Mention the word demon, and almost everyone has an immediate response regardless of which side they stand upon. Thankfully for us, author, investigator, and star of numerous paranormal television shows, Richard Estep goes in search of demons on our behalf. We'll look at how balance and perspective beat at the heart of this book as Richard takes us on the hunt for clarity in such a diversive term. But before that, of course, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mystriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual, and thank you to each and every one of you that continue to support the show. It means a great deal. Mysteries and Monsters is across most social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes and news, and you can also visit our merchandise store exclusively through TeePublic by clicking the links in the show notes. Our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork, and the show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. And Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Now, without further ado, let's join Richard Estep in search of demons. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, it seems that demons are lurking around every corner. Taking a balanced view in regards to this perceived plague is Richard Estep, the celebrated author, investigator, EMT, and a man with countless paranormal television appearances. Richard, after a terribly long time between appearances, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters, sir.
Thank you for having me on the show again, Paul. I do appreciate it.
It's always nice to see a Brit doing well for themselves abroad, Richard, and you are a prime example of a paranormal star, as far as I'm concerned, leading the light to show some British tenacity in the face of some incredible hauntings that you've worked on over the years.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate your kind words. I just like to write, I like to have adventures, and I like to share them with people.
You certainly do. You're a man who doesn't seem to face fear in regards to the reputations of numerous haunted and fearsome locations around the States and even abroad as well. I mean, here we are talking about your latest book, In Search of Demons, which was released in September. And I remember when I saw the publishing update advising of this, and the first thing that crossed my mind, Richard, was I wonder if there's a sense of trepidation diving into this topic, not specifically in regards to demons, but as you will well know more than most, Richard, this seems to be a subject that people tend to fall into 2 camps on, and either side of it causes controversy and consternation no matter which way you're looking at it.
It does, and I think there are several reasons for that, Paul. One is, of course, that many people are emotionally invested in this. You know, you can kind of argue in good cheer with somebody about whether ghosts are real or cryptids, Mothman, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness, or whatever. But demons cut to the heart of many people's belief system and their core beliefs, you know. So I think it's a very emotionally charged and heated subject for some people, more so in the US than in the UK and Europe. And then there's also the fact that there are some people who are very financially dependent upon making you believe that demons are not just real, but they're coming to get you.
I think people would be surprised because I would suspect that we're both singing from a similar hymn sheet, Richard. We know enough about how certain aspects of the thing we love in the world of the paranormal work. And it is very interesting to me seeing this kind of change, as I said in the introduction, over the sort of the last 20, 30 years, where you would barely come across cases involving demons other than some of the more notorious ones. Obviously, the case that was the inspiration for the book of The Exorcist is a prime example. Some of the ones from medieval Europe, I'm thinking primarily of the monastery in France. I think it was with the with
Yeah,
Ken
you're talking
Russell.
about Loudun, the Devils of Loudun.
Yes, which is one of Ken Russell's stranger films, which is one of those phrases I never thought I'd mention because he's released many a weird film over his career. And so when you look at it now, as you mentioned there does seem to be a kind of culture of promoting fear in certain aspects of it. And this seems to perfectly encapsulate demons and demonology in the modern paranormal era.
It really, really does. And, I make my living as a paramedic, so I work with emergency responders, and I know a few detectives and police officers. And, I know at least several of them that also investigate the paranormal. And one of the wise things a detective once told me is, always ask yourself who benefits from a certain thing. And in the case of demons, who benefits from fear, who benefits from, demons essentially being these ever-present, dark, terrifying, dangerous entities, which just so happen, by the way, to be living in a house in Arkansas.
Yes.
It's the people that are putting themselves out there and promoting themselves, and they are trolling for likes and clicks and views and subscribes. I go face the demonic house of death, hit subscribe to find out if I survive, that kind of thing.
Yeah, with the terrified thumbnail enticing us in.
The thumbnails are just horrific, right? I seriously do mean that. I mean, how scared are you genuinely? How I don't want to soapbox. It does, though. It demeans and belittles the work of people that are seriously looking for answers in this field. Because if these people really are going up against demons, and they are in the greatest danger, not just of their lives, but their soul is at risk for all eternity, right?
Yes.
And you're going to go in there with a GoPro and an online certificate maybe you got in demonology, and you're going to square off against the ultimate evil.
Yeah.
Or is something a bit rotten in Denmark, as the saying goes?
Absolutely. I suppose when you came to pull this book together, Richard, did you have an idea, a sort of game plan of what you were going to do? Because the thing that strikes me about this particular book is the title alone would maybe entice certain people to believe it's going to be of a certain ilk in regards to what's included in its covers. What I found wonderfully refreshing was that there is an overriding balance that runs throughout all the book. You've got interviews and experiences from everybody's perception, it would seem, that has skin in the game, as they would say, taking various viewpoints, speaking with experiences, people that investigate this, people of religious faiths, bishops, exorcists, skeptics, stage magicians. You haven't gone at this sort of half-hearted and played to either side. I think the wonderful thing about this particular book is it's straight down the middle, and we're just getting a variety of viewpoints that enable a balanced and educated reader to perhaps go into this and come out the other side with a very different perception as to what they would have begun reading it with.
Thank you. That was my intent. I mean, I really wrote the book I wanted to read, and there is no shortage of demons are real books out there that don't question. They just simply put that out there as fact. Then there are also quite a few books written by skeptics that scoff and mock the very possibility that demons could be real, which, I think you do a real disservice to the beliefs of half the planet when you just dismiss this out of hand. And I didn't find any books that walk that middle path, that walk that middle ground. And so I tried to approach this with what is the evidence, and to how many decimal places, which in some ways it's almost impossible to square that circle, because many people will tell you, well, demons are a matter of faith, which is true to a point, but they're supposed to have these real world consequences, the ability to manifest in our world and to influence us. So that was something I could investigate. That was something I could go put boots on the ground, talk to some specialists, and see where the land lay.
Were you surprised in regards to how open people were about discussing this in a more sort of nuanced way, Richard, rather than people claiming fire and brimstone would rain down if you discuss this dismissively, or people that just thought, well, why are you writing about this? This is all stuff and nonsense.
I was very pleasantly surprised, but by almost everybody, because I did not get any or a great deal of rhetoric, I think, from anybody. Even, you would expect when I interview a Catholic, a member of the old Catholic Church who was a bishop and had done exorcisms, he was very thoughtful and very enlightened and gave me a lot of food for thought. There was no desk pounding or anything like that by people trying to make their point. I just got this broad range of opinions, and that's exactly what I wanted to share with the readership.
Was it difficult to keep yourself open, Richard, regardless? Because I think any of us that enjoy or work or create in the paranormal, whether we believe it or not, we all have personal bias, depending on where we come from. It could be how we've been brought up. It could be our as you mentioned, our strand of belief that we hold dear to us. It could be our scientific grounding that makes us look at certain things. And I think sometimes people would be surprised, because I would consider you to be similar to myself in the fact that we're skeptical believers, and the word skeptic seems to have been weaponized in certain fraternities.
It does, and I think the word skeptic gets an unfair rap. I have several friends that are skeptics. Dr. Karen Stolzno, Blake Smith, who do the Monster Cast, things like that. But Monster Talk podcast, rather. But I think skeptic really is just, at least skeptic has become entwined with denier, right? And there are deniers that call themselves skeptics, but the true definition of skepticism, in my opinion, is it's somebody who's saying these are some pretty out there claims. So what is the evidence? Let's weigh that. Let's evaluate it and see if it supports these claims. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And yeah, you're right about bias. We all do come in with our own biases, and mine was cultural. I mean, I began investigating the paranormal in the mid-90s in the UK, when, this was the realm of Peter Underwood.
Yes.
And Andrew Green. My idea of paranormal investigation, it wasn't even called that then. It was just outright called ghost hunting, Yes. And it was men. And I realized it was a very male-centric field then, by the way. And I'm so glad to see a number of very strong female researchers changing that these days.
Yes.
But it was primarily middle-aged old white men in tweed jackets and pipes wandering around stately homes looking for ladies in white at midnight, It was very romantic and very cool. And the young boy that grew up on ghost stories that I loved that stuff.
Yeah.
The only time I encountered what you might call a potentially demonic case, I wrote about in my first book, In Search of the Paranormal, and it was at a church near Louth, Lincolnshire, St. Botolph's, which it had been in the newspapers, that Paragon, the Leicester Mercury, my hometown newspaper, as the demon church. And because people had seen supposedly a thing with glowing red eyes in the bell tower of this long abandoned, desecrated church, which had been desecrated by a satanic coven, it was said. So I spent some time there, did have some unusual activity, nothing I would remotely call demonic, other than one thing I can never explain, a loud screeching noise that came out of thin air in the middle of the church. It sounded like some kind of animal. Very, very strange. Couldn't explain it. Was it demonic? I don't know. But the majority of cases that I've worked, I would say 99.9% of them had nothing to do with demons. Come to the States, and even then, I came to the States in 1999. The demon, apart from the Warrens and the East Coast stuff, because, of course, demonology is very East Coast centric in the U.S., probably because of the puritanical underpinnings of that region's history. But there weren't that many. And then, certain TV shows started finding demons, and they started having hosts that were possessed, and they discovered, I think, that demons were immensely popular. People wanted to see more of them because they were scarier. The ante had been upped. Ghosts were no longer scary enough to get ratings. Poltergeists, ghosts, spirits of the dead, no longer scary enough. We need minions of hell, and we need one every week, please. And that's really where it started, Paul. I think that's where this juggernaut really got rolling around about 2009, 2010.
It is interesting, like you refer to there. I mean, I've got everything Peter Underwood released. And as you say, I consider him and his ilk to be the gentleman ghost hunter, where they'd all sit about very nicely. They may have a couple of glasses and brandy and a cigar or a pipe around the fire before they wandered around numerous beautiful stately homes that the UK had to offer for them. And it seems a bit more sort of all action these days.
It does.
And so it is interesting. I think for me, what really began to open my eyes was the late 90s when the internet kicked off and I was able to listen to Coast to Coast in the UK online.
Art Bell.
Yes. And so I was able to hear a couple of interviews with Brad Steiger, who was probably my first introduction to this kind of perception of demons and demonology. Brad was a prolific writer. I mean, he was one of those people, I don't know how he had time to do anything, almost as if he didn't sleep. Some would say he wrote like a demon.
Let me, if I may just interrupt, because I never met Brad, but I have many of his books, and we share a publisher. That publisher is Visible Ink Press. Yeah. And they still keep Brad's books in print, and some Visible Ink authors are updating them. But I love Brad, and I love his work, and it's one of my great regrets that I never met him and had a chance to talk writing with him. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, but he's one of those things that, there are interviews that he did almost 30 years ago, Richard, and I love listening to him because he was such an eloquent and interesting speaker on a wide range of topics that even into the modern era, I think, regardless of how you view some of his work or some of the subjects he discussed, he's an essential person. As we mentioned earlier on, people like Peter Underwood and Andrew Green, these are essential researchers and writers that we still should hold close to our hearts, even into the modern age, because there's a lot we can learn by looking backwards to the work that these gentlemen did. Absolutely.
I could not agree with you more. And again, Peter Underwood and Brad Steiger are probably the two writers, with a side of Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who it's also my great regret I never met Rosemary. But those are the kind of writers who were inquisitive. They seemed balanced. I know Brad went into some very strange waters, but he always let the reader kind of decide for themselves what they believed.
Yes.
He wouldn't say, and this is true. He would just say, but you decide, which is kind of the approach I've stolen. Yeah. Let's be honest. But yeah, I'd like to be them when I grow up.
I suppose when you were looking at this book, there are numerous locations. I mean, you often wonder how many houses can have a demon living in it. The amount of demon houses you can find on YouTube is remarkable. It seems that almost every state in America has one, Richard.
And you can rent almost all of them overnight for a modest fee.
Yeah. Which, like you said earlier on, which kind of opens up the possibility of if these things are so terrifying, why on earth would anybody go in there, as you say, armed with very little spiritual protection to face down such entities?
Well, an obvious answer is, of course, there are content creators that are doing it for views, to very cynically, burnish their CVs, their resumes, and to make money, clicks, likes, subscribes. But I also think there's another, and this is kind of an unpleasant truth that we all could look at, because the ego plays a role in all of human life. I'm not immune to it. You're not. We all have egos, you know. And I think the idea that there are people in the field that derive their identity and their satisfaction on the idea that they stand toe-to-toe with the forces of darkness. They are the heroes of this story because they will go into this dark and demonic house and they'll put themselves at risk of being possessed, taken over, thrown down the stairs, or whatever it is. And then they will go back to their life on Monday morning and lead their everyday life. It's a chance for some people to I think, portray themselves as kind of paranormal superheroes, for want of a better term.
And it's intriguing as well in that kind of aspect, because often sometimes you will see certain shows or whatever, and people will turn up and they'll do everything they need to do, and then they just bugger off. And I think, well, if these people are that terrified, that doesn't seem to be the best kind of aftercare for such things, because the other aspect, I think, often in such particular cases as we're touching on, is that, as you say, the ego can sometimes take over, and often the case becomes about the investigator, not the people that are being affected, which I think is a very strange way to start looking at things, because surely the primary concern for anybody in such cases, Richard, and I'm sure you've had to deal with many personal investigations where you're helping people who are having trouble of a variety of reasons in their homes or their properties, is that they still have to live there regardless. And so if somebody comes in and then just goes, what happens afterwards? That's always left kind of a bad taste in my mouth, because often it's almost as if the witnesses and the experiences aren't central to the story anymore.
Right. But hey, the content creator has their footage, they have their show, and thanks very much. Bye. And maybe they paid a location fee for that, but yeah, it's you're right to be cynical about this. I do think that when you look at it, though, from the point of view of someone who's coming in to aggrandize themselves or benefit themselves as opposed to actually help somebody and to actually find answers, 90% of what a paranormal investigator does, a legitimate paranormal investigator, bears no fruit. You sit in a lot of dark hallways with a lot of nothing happening, being very bored. And we used to do this. It blows my mind now.
Yes.
We used to do this before cell phones.
Yes.
There was no doom scrolling back in 1997. I worked with a guy who genuinely used to bribe his kids to watch his VHS tapes from investigations. They would watch hours of empty hallways, and he would bribe them with like chocolate because there was a whole lot of nothing going on. Yeah. Now we can sit there and we can doom scroll right while we're waiting for something to happen. But it's boring. It's dull. It should be. Yes. Because you are waiting around for something that, I'm very, very skeptical of anyone who gets results at every location every time. If you actually shot a TV show based on my investigations, I would say 80% minimum of that footage, if not 90%, is nothing happening. It's wasting. It's stomach growls, it's things of that nature. Yeah. But unfortunately, it became an entertainment industry, and of course, in those kind of industries, you have to deliver results, don't you? And there are those that will get those results above anything else, and that skews the narrative. It's not research; it's entertainment.
I suppose one of the other aspects of this often is that when you have certain properties with horrific histories, Richard, sometimes that seems to get trodden all over as well, because I know recently there's been some kind of people in the paranormal, quite rightly, talking about the ethical problems that certain things and certain locations, why do people want to try and get there? You see this more and more in the modern era, I think, as we say with social media, that people need to go to certain locations where something awful's happened. And it's like the old term where, when we were all kids and they'd mentioned the term rubbernecking. If you've seen an accident on a motorway or something, Richard, the traffic slows down purely because everybody's looking across the carriageway to what's happened. And it's awful. But it seems that this has permeated into the paranormal to an extent that once again, it's something else that I find quite distasteful, because it's very difficult sometimes to draw a line. What are the rules about how long is it since a tragedy should we go? Because often people will talk about visiting, and as you know very well, Richard, places like Gettysburg and other Civil War places across the US. You can't walk across Britain without crossing certain battlefields from some skirmish throughout the centuries. And yet we still have these incidents in the modern era where there's been terrible murders. The Elsa Lam case is a prime example of people just sort of congregating on a tragic death of a woman suffering greatly for whatever reason. Yeah,
I wrote about that in my book, American Hotel Stories.
Yes.
And I make, if I may, I made the case in that book that, I believe what happened in that case. There's plenty of evidence, speaking as a medical professional, but not a psychological professional. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that she experienced a severe mental health episode. We don't need to introduce, the distasteful, the paranormal, in order to explain what happened to her, which is true in most cases. And this is not new. I mean, the obvious one goes back to the 70s, Paul, and that's the Amityville. I mean, that was a year after the murders, I think it was, that became a thing. All of a sudden, to me, the big tragedy of Amityville is, number one, the deaths of the DeFeo family under such horrific circumstances. And number two, the way that those deaths have been milked by opportunists for not just years, but decades. They're making money on the graves of these people. And yeah, there is an ethical component. I mean, I ran into this myself. I did a lot of soul searching when I wrote my book on Fox Hollow Farm.
Yes.
In Indiana, the Herb Baumeister case.
Yes.
Those murders took place in the 90s. There were a couple of reasons I ended up writing that book, because I almost didn't. One was that, the house did experience significant paranormal activity, and I wanted that story to be told. And number two, I wanted to make sure that, my hope was that if I wrote it as opposed to somebody else, it would not be lurid. It would be balanced and respectful. It was a case of, well, somebody's going to do this. I do have access to the location, so I would like to tell that story my way as fairly as I can. So that was kind of my intent. But still, yeah, you're right. How much time is enough time? I mean, a good case in point was that I went to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, Scranton, Pennsylvania, for the crash site of United Flight 93. I was going to Gettysburg. I was on a paranormal trip, a road trip to visit haunted locations. At no point did it ever cross my mind that we would do any investigation at that site, because that's sacred ground. Innocent people lost their lives in 2001. It's the raw wound, you know. I wouldn't dream of investigating at Ground Zero in New York either. Now you hear, after, you know, America, of course, let's not get into the horrific mass shooting situation we have here in the US. You have one every day now, but there are people that have to be shooed away because they're wandering around these scenes the day after with voice recorders trying to get EVPs, and it's just disgusting. Yes. I don't know how much time is appropriate. Like the Civil War seems like a reasonable time frame to me. 10, 15, 20 years ago doesn't, you know. It just seems like it's a little too raw. But how do you put an arbitrary number on this is long enough?
Absolutely.
What do you think?
I mean, it's a difficult question. It is a dilemma for people who are interested in these things, because it's how long is long enough for sometimes. And I think if you've got a situation where there are still relatives or people who lost people in a specific situation or incident, Richard, I think you run the risk there of causing more grief to people who have already lost enough. And I suspect that for me, it's a matter of going into these circumstances in good faith, because there are situations, I mean, like you mentioned there, some of the events that occurred at 9/11. Obviously, we have a couple of incidents over here, such as the bombings in London in 2005, 7/7. You know, I've passed through that tube station several times. At no point has it ever crossed my mind that there should be any consideration for doing such a paranormal investigation in that. And to be fair, there are enough haunted tube stations in London that you don't need to go picking those scabs of recent grief.
You know, we're on the same page. I investigated the London Underground A station, and this, to be clear, was a power and maintenance station, not an actual tube station. But I did that, and I wrote about it in one of my books. And I have a new book coming out in February where it's kind of an overview of various different hauntings and paranormal phenomena. And I did write about the ghost of the London Underground there. Again, at no point, though, am I going to go to Moorgate or the scene of, you know, an absolute tragedy and throw down a voice recorder and start. It just feels wrong, you know?
Absolutely. Well, it's something I was reading recently here, Richard, in Sheffield. Obviously, the scene of probably, well, the worst football disaster in England. Yeah. Now, that was 1989. And I've often thought, I'm very surprised that we don't hear anything about this. Lo and behold, about 6-7 weeks ago, during October, there were a couple of local stories that appeared talking about people mentioning experiences and such like that. And that made me feel very uncomfortable. I have lots of friends who are Liverpool fans. I know 2 people that passed on that particular day.
I'm so sorry.
And it's still one of those things. And obviously, I'm one of those people. I still take flowers there as a memorial to the events on that April day. And so that, even so, 35 years on, Richard, still makes me feel uncomfortable. Even when I'm in that location, I walk past that, because I remember several years later I went to see my team play there, and that's the away end. So that's the end you go in. And I've never wanted to get out of a football ground quicker in my life. And whenever I've had the opportunity of going back there, I've always made a point of not sitting in that stand. Regardless of my beliefs in the paranormal, for me, I just feel uncomfortable sitting there.
I wouldn't blame you at all. And so, you know, there are certain things in the field, I think, that there are certain doors we should leave closed, or at least for you know, for the foreseeable future. As someone who's had professional involvement with disasters in my career, I would not take kindly to paranormal investigators or content creators poking around those sites while this is still a raw, festering wound for the families.
I suppose that gives you an extra edge when you're covering a subject such as this as well, Richard, as we mentioned in regards to these beliefs and alleged real occurrences in regards to people experiencing demons, that because of your experience in the medical field and the work you've done and the people you know, as we were talking about the Lamb case, it is surprising how sometimes severe mental illness crises can be sort of written off and placed in baskets where people say, oh, well, that behaviour is so unusual, they must be possessed. Whereas anybody who's suffered from mental health or has any experience in it knows that there are some extreme responses and reactions when people feel that they can't cope anymore, regardless. And what we may find extremely unusual behaviour in the pantheon of mental illness history and support and the work that psychiatrists and mental health practitioners do in that, for them it's nothing unusual. But to anybody who doesn't perhaps have any experience in that, they can completely misunderstand the symptoms that are being shown. Yeah,
and the stigma of mental health, this is a subject that both needs to be talked about more and needs to be talked about and approached carefully and with respect. But we are living in times when I think mental illness has never been as prevalent as it is today, or it certainly seems that way. And, to dismiss the need of somebody who clearly needs mental health care and treatment, to dismiss them as being possessed is wrong on so many levels. Now, just to play devil's advocate, which seems, I know, ironic with a book about demons, those that are members of the Catholic Church will turn around and say, well, if you are mentally unwell, you are depressed, you're suffering, you are more open, more prone, more vulnerable to possession, because the psychic defenses that most people have, when they're in I don't want to use a normal, but their baseline state, let's say, are degraded. You're easier to be victimized by dark and demonic forces. That's what they say anyway. I do wonder how many times in history cases of mental illness have been explained away as possession, and people have been, injured, tortured, killed because of it. Again, Catholics and folks of certain religious beliefs will tell you, though, that there are cases of possession which are misdiagnosed as mental illness, and that firmly enters the waters of what do you believe as an individual.
Absolutely. I found it quite interesting. I was speaking to a reverend over the summer, Reverend Alison Dunlop, and she was saying that she's dealt with exorcists, but one of the things she does is she works in conjunction with medical practitioners, because the first things, as far as she's concerned, is they need to evaluate the person who's claiming to be possessed, because more often than not, it will be somebody having a mental health crisis. And depending where you're from and your family, you may fall into that religious dogma that says you're not mentally ill, you're possessed. And so these are the things I think sometimes we forget about certain parts of the United Kingdom, that they are still deeply entrenched in certain religious followings, more so than perhaps England is, and Wales, I would suggest, Richard. If you look at Northern Ireland and Scotland, perhaps. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Again, belief plays such a role. Belief is immensely powerful. So by the same token, I do like that the church, before authorizing an exorcism, has a requirement that a mental health evaluation by a qualified professional is performed before authorization. I think that's absolutely necessary. But, I talked to one mental health professional that absolutely blew me away when I was writing this book. He said, my take on this is very simple. If an exorcism might help, why not? Give it a try. What's the harm? Which is the last thing I expected to hear. But, I kind of think of exorcism personally as an agnostic. I think of it as a kind of spiritual placebo effect. Yes. The placebo effect is real. It works. You can't argue with it. It's documented. It's rigorously researched. Why would exorcism or prayer not be something similar? If to one, and by the way, I am not saying that prayer or exorcism, I'm not denigrating them. I am not saying that they're stupid. But if somebody were to say, prayer is a waste of time, exorcism is stupid, there is that old saying that if it sounds stupid and it works, by definition, it is not stupid, right? Yes. So absolutely. If the problem's cured with an exorcism, why not? The only caveat I would add is this. Exorcism is a broad term. People die under exorcism every year. There have been many tragic cases. The obvious one, of course, is, the exorcism of Annalise Michel. Yes. Where the poor girl was essentially starved and stressed to death. And, we do see this happen in various cultures around the world where they die while exorcists are trying to rid them of what they perceive to be some kind of possessing force. Exorcism certainly kills more people, demonstrably, provably, each year
then we can prove that demons do.
Yeah. Well, it's strange you mentioned that, Richard, because obviously where I grew up, there was an extremely famous case which involved a gentleman called Michael Taylor, who was part of a church in Barnsley in South Yorkshire, who went through an extremely rigorous exorcism because he was showing and displaying extremely strange behaviour. He was attacking other members of the congregation, making sexual advances on people, being violent outbursts and swearing at people for no reason. And so rather than refer him for medical assistance, they went on this sort of all-night exorcism that basically left everybody exhausted. He went away. 2 weeks later, he murdered his wife.
Yeah.
And so he ended up being psychiatrically evaluated and ended up in Broadmoor. I mean, the strangest thing about that particular case was he served 4 years in a mental institution and then was released into the general public, and he's still living in West Yorkshire to this day. Yeah. That's one of the strangest things, but I think that's a prime example of that kind of philosophy, Richard, that you have to look that their duty of care was to the person, not the church. And that it would seem that when it came to Michael Taylor, as you mentioned, numerous other individuals around the world, often that gets overridden. And these days, there seems to be more of a duty of care to whoever claims to be suffering from some kind of infestation or possession, that they make sure that they cross out all the alternatives before going into that, regardless.
Yeah, and it's one of those, hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? And those that were in the thick of it, no doubt, thought they were doing the best thing possible at the time. But yeah, those kind of safeguards needed to be in place. That Michael Taylor, I'm not that familiar with the case, but from what you're telling me, it sounds to me as though absolutely the wrong path to care and treatment was chosen, and it ended in tragedy.
Yeah, he was a ticking time bomb, and it's one of those. I'm not suggesting that what they did pushed him further down the brink. It may have happened regardless, Richard, but it's certainly one of those that it gives you food for thought in regards to how we view these things in the modern era, because obviously that's 50 years ago. Things have changed a great deal because of cases such as that.
Absolutely. And I hope that we're entering more enlightened times, but I'm not entirely sure that we are. I mean, belief in the demonic and possession is, it's skyrocketing, and you look at The Conjuring being $1 billion franchise.
Yes.
And it just kind of makes me shake my head, because too many, I think, mistake what they're seeing is essentially a Hollywood fantasy is fact. And I know that the Warrens are controversial. I did not know them personally, did not have any interaction with them, so I can't speak to that. But they are very polarizing figures. But I will say that, clearly you look at those movies, and they do not even represent what was documented, of the Warrens' cases. The second Conjuring movie is a travesty. I've said it before, and I'll say it loudly. What it does to the reputations of Guy Lyon Playfair and Maurice Grosse is awful. It trashes the work of two excellent researchers and writers.
Yes.
Sidelines them in order for grandstanding by, the Warrens were at Enfield for a morning.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
But anyway, we live in a realm now where it's increasingly difficult to separate reality from fantasy for many people. And if it appears on a screen or on a page, it must be real, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There is a lack of critical thinking sometimes when it comes to this. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of speaking with Guy Lyon Playfair several years ago, and he was so generous with his time. And it was just after the second Conjuring film had come out. And I can't repeat what he thought of it, Richard. I will say that.
I'm jealous. I try not to be jealous, but I'm jealous that you got to spend time with him. He's one of my idols. And whenever I'm asked what book should be on the shelves of everyone who's interested in the paranormal, This House is Haunted is top of that list.
Absolutely.
It is a classic, almost the perfect case study of a haunting and poltergeist case. And, I think that Grosse and Playfair, they looked into Enfield. They both had their thoughts, but the word demon never came near. It's not in that book, as far as I recall at all.
No. I mean, that was quite interesting when I was looking at some of the locations you'd visited. Valeska and the Sally House primarily. Because they're two hauntings that I know, well, two alleged hauntings that I know very well. The Sally House is one of those, probably my first real experience of international paranormal television, because the Sally House.
Tell me you got that from Sightings.
Yes.
Tell me you were, yeah.
Always reminds me of Sightings, Richard, from the mid to late 90s.
Yeah, let me put my psychic powers to work here, and I say that with my tongue firmly in cheek. You were one of those kids or young men. You had a Sky dish or a B Sky B dish. We're now confusing every listener that's not from the UK from the 90s, right? Yes. And Sky would just run episodes of Sightings, and it was the Heartland Haunting, I believe it was then.
Yes.
Yeah. I loved it. I loved that show. It was where I got my big boluses of American paranormal stuff. So, you know. For Sightings, I'm Tim White. I can still hear it. Who was incredibly an Air Force general was his side job, believe it or not, Tim White. But yeah, so I found that compelling, and I actually spent time in the house, and I got to interview Deborah Pickman and Tony Pickman, who they lived that nightmare. And Deborah has a book out called The Sally House Haunting, also by Llewellyn, just as a plug for her. But it's a very well written story. They've been called, they've been trashed. Their reputation has been trashed. They've been told you made it all up. This was not genuine. I found them actually to be compelling and credible witnesses. And I do think, though, that the Sally House today, there are people I know that will just never set foot in that house or never set foot there again. I do think that whatever may have been there in the past is probably not as present as it was 20 years ago.
Mm. It is. It's one of those things that I can remember watching that footage of. I think it's Tony who gets scratched all the time. Because the thing about the Sally House was that whatever was there just didn't like men, and so it would just scratch them. And obviously, you'd usually get the 3 or 4 deep, look extremely painful scratches, because that was one of the things that made it quite compelling and even drawing blood on occasion. And so even someone playing devil's advocate or trying to be balanced about that would often find the sort of explanation that, oh, well, he must have done it himself, where I can remember seeing one and it was right in the middle of his back, which, unless Tony was a secret contortionist, Richard, there's no way he could have got his nails down that far his back without sort of dislocating his shoulders.
Well, and you look at the amount of money that the Pickmans made on that case, it was actually pretty small. Their book, I know what Paranormal Publishing pays in terms of royalties, and, I promise you they're not living high on the hog on one book's royalties, or even 10.
Yes.
And in exchange, I mean, they lost a lot of their privacy. They dealt with being mocked, with being ridiculed. I don't see any motive for them, even if they had been able to fake this stuff, which I don't think they did. I don't see any motive for them having done so. So I found it a credible case, but I also think that the house itself, which is well worth a visit, if for no other reason than to have the cultural dissonance I had of sitting in that living room, and those episodes of Sightings are on YouTube.
Yes.
So I sat in that living room and I watched Sightings, the episodes I've watched in my living room in Leicester back in the 90s. I watched them in that house. There were just chills going down my spine.
Yeah.
And man, did I hear footsteps upstairs. I thought it was terrific. So something's active. I mean, that was one of my great personal moments in my career. Just, things that make me glad I get to do this and feel honored to do it.
Yeah. Was the house the same layout then?
Yeah. Oh. The layout's the same. I mean, they've put some things in there now. There are self-guided tours that are run through the city. So, for example, there are informational notes on the walls and things of that nature. But for the most part, the house is the same layout. But even then, when you look at the story of Sally, it all comes back to the medium Peter James.
Yes.
There's no verifiable evidence that Sally ever existed, that there was this little girl that was brought to the house and operated on without anesthesia. There's not a shred of evidence to support it other than this man's contention.
Yes. Well, Peter as well is someone who's synonymous with sightings, because especially I remember his investigations of the Queen Mary. He seemed to live there, Richard.
Yeah. I was there a couple of months ago in the swimming pool, and here's something you may not know, because this absolutely knocked me sideways when they told me. They said, Peter's still here, right? And I'm like, what do you mean? They said, oh, yeah, his ashes are in the archives. He requested it.
Wow.
So Peter James's ashes are still on the Queen Mary. And, he's the one that gave us the story about the swimming pool and the little girl and things of that nature. Again, you have to be, and I'm not casting aspersions on Peter James, but when you're dealing purely with the testimony of a self-professed psychic or medium, that alone does not constitute evidence. It cannot.
Yeah.
So, grain of salt.
Yes. And I think often, whilst we know that there are certain locations where tragedies have happened, there is a lot of historical data. You can get the deeds and see who lived there and the families that have been in certain properties, Richard, and you can look at the records. You can see the births, the deaths, the marriages. You can check the local graveyards. It is surprising. This seems to be something I think there is falling away, that we have these substantiated sort of solutions to certain hauntings where, as you say, if there's no evidence for that particular entity or spirit being there, then you would suggest that, well, why is it still being put forward as an explanation when often with certain houses and certain properties, you will have enough normal situations of people passing and tragedies that occur to people we all know. We all have friends and family and people we've worked with over the years where they've had a tragic incident in their lives in a home or with people that lived in that particular home. It always seems to be, I think sometimes when we look back at some of these historical cases, some of the explanations seem to be just sort of plucking the cliches, as it were, to be put forward, because it's always sort of a tragic story. And often it's not necessarily that. Or perhaps, I remember speaking with Ruth Roper Wild, and there was a particular haunting she'd investigated where the general consensus was it was the headless ghost of a particular woman who died in her 20s. But when you check the records, this woman lived till she was 84. Yeah. So it can't be her. So who the hell is it? Because that straight away, you can find that disputes the urban myth that's sprung up about this haunting. Something's going on, but it's not the person they're saying it is. Well, and then we come back to the whole, print the legend, right, as the old saying goes. Yes. But we do have to be careful because there are people in the field. I want to give a shout out, for example, to the writer Jamie Rubio. Jamie was like leading that charge, and yes, there have been others, but Jamie was leading that charge with regard to the Conjuring House, to talk about how Bathsheba Sherman was not in fact some baby worshipping, Satanist. Yeah. And Bathsheba, there are real world consequences to these stories. Bathsheba Sherman's grave was smashed and desecrated many, many times. Yeah. All because of this narrative that was put forth in a Warner Brothers movie. And it's just kind of disgusting because you are seeing the reputations of the dead who are no longer around to defend themselves, obviously being tarnished. The thought of that happening to one of us 200, 300, 400 years down the line should be repellent. And all in the name of entertainment. Yeah. It's interesting. I know recently there was the haunting show that Paramount, I think, did, Richard, which was like 4 cases. One of them included the Conjuring House. Oh, I must have missed that. It was on, I think it was released in the States a couple of years ago. It's just been shown on the BBC over here. So if you've got BBC America, no doubt you can probably catch it. And one of the particular episodes focused on the Conjuring House. And what was interesting in that was that when people started questioning the Warrens after the film came out, they kept blaming the local historian who wasn't alive anymore. And so they told them this story and they found the evidence that supported what they said. Now the evidence has been proven that none of that story is true, like her being hung from a tree and all that. I mean, if she was that bad, like I say, anybody who knows anything about how those people who allegedly were viewed by religious organisations, why is she buried in a graveyard then? That alone makes you think. We know enough about history where people who took their own life or people who were classed as sinful were buried next to the graveyard outside the bounds, usually on the other side of the wall in a special garden, Richard. And so that made me kind of chuckle that now we're blaming somebody who can't be questioned because they're no longer here. Therefore, we have another strand to that particular thread that needs to be pulled. And so, as we touched on Amityville, that's always left a sour taste in my mouth because everybody seems to overlook the horrific events of the night that started all this. And DeFeo is a prime example of someone who was very good at changing his story to be whatever someone who was interviewing it wanted it to be. I've seen 4 interviews with him over the years, and each time he's got a different explanation. One was it was drugs and the mafia, then it was his sister, then after, I remember the one where he blamed his sister. He was laughing about people saying, "Oh, my defense attorney told me I should blame the devil." And then the next time somebody came along and interviewed him, he started saying he'd been possessed because they were a paranormal writer.
Well, the possession story, DeFeo's lawyer came out and said that he cooked that story up with the Lutzes over 2 bottles of wine.
Yes.
That was that's a matter of record that he said that. Ronnie DeFeo, firstly, hands down, he was a murderer, right? Yes, I know that there are actually some credible researchers who give weight to the possibility that his sister may have assisted in the murders, right? But we will never know.
Yes.
For sure, we know that he was involved, right? His rifle, all that kind of stuff, means motive opportunity. There are some weird elements to the Amityville case.
Yes.
Weird with a lowercase w. Why did nobody hear gunshots at that time of the night from a high-powered rifle, all those kind of things? But again, you don't need to go near ghosts. This narrative comes up because it was seen as a clever way to try and get him declared insane, or the devil made me do it.
Yes.
Right? It's the classic, and here we are back to The Conjuring again. The devil made me do it.
Yeah.
And there is also a letter that DeFeo wrote to one of the local reporters that was covering his case. And I paraphrase here, Paul, because I don't have it in front of me, but I have written about this specifically and quoted it in one of my books. And DeFeo said, "We both know that the only demon in Amityville was me."
Yeah.
And it's true, right? I mean, that's it. Possession and all that kind of stuff. I personally, having reviewed, the evidence from the Amityville haunting, I don't find it a particularly credible case. I know that there are those, like, for example, I've never met Christopher Quarantino, formerly Lutz, myself, but I know people that are friends of his who do find him credible. And he maintains that, paranormal stuff did happen in that house. And I wasn't there, so I can't say. What I will say is that following the money and the motive, people made a lot of money on this, primarily Jay Anson, the author.
Yes.
and the movie studios that, it's a great movie, right? The Amityville Horror is one of those classic movies. And I think it is the first time we see anywhere something now every paranormal investigator has on their bingo card, the voice that says, "Get out."
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
We get that on EVPs and spirit boxes, all kinds of stuff. That's the first, I think, place it appeared like commonly was in that movie. It's become classic. But I think the DeFeos have been done a great wrong by the whole Amityville Horror sideshow.
Yeah, I think it takes away from the tragic events of that night, personally.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get spoken about enough.
And I think the problem of it is, that's why I'd wanted to write about it and have, but I think the problem is that the minute you introduce this idea of the devil made me do it, you abrogate responsibility, right? Yes. It's far less scary to think the devil and demons are real and can possess you and make you kill someone. It's far less scary, I think, than to think that people just snap, people just have bad wiring, people have psychological crises and breakdowns, and those people are among us right now. They look like us. They are us. Jeff Belanger, as I interviewed him for the book, he said, you go to a penitentiary and you talk to the people on death row, how many of them were temporarily possessed? I mean, not in a literal sense, but they were not themselves when they snapped. You don't need the devil for that. No. What you need is a better understanding of mental health crises and anger management and why people do the things that they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Amityville, strangely enough, as we were saying about that series I've mentioned about the Country House, they do an episode on Amityville and Christopher's in that, talking about it. And he gets quite upset because there's clearly a lot of trauma in regards to the family unit rather than just this haunting. And as he says, strange things were happening, but it was nowhere near the level that ended up becoming the narrative of that particular location. And so you've got to take a step back, like you're saying, I think, because one of the other interesting locations you mentioned is Valeska. I'm fascinated by this, not in a sort of morbid sense, Richard, because it's one of those things that when you discover one of these particular cases, I'm amazed how many incidents of this nature there are in America at that period of time. There are at least a dozen I can think of where someone's turned up at somebody's house with an axe and murdered everybody in it. Valeska is not a unique case. And that, for me, is even more intriguing, because when we talk about murder, as we were saying about DeFeo, obviously he shot everybody else in the house, regardless of the other aspects and explanations of it. He's still, as you say, he's a murderer. But it's the fact that, as far as I'm aware, most of them are unsolved. They all seem to have happened completely by random. There's so many weird facets to it. And so I'm intrigued as to why now people have begun to sort of prescribe a demon to what happened at Valeska, when, once again, as you've just eloquently put it, Richard, there are strange people who look just like us wandering about, who just snap for some reason. And so that is a prime example of how the history has now become, it would seem, a different kind of haunting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do encourage any of your listeners, and if you haven't read it yourself, Paul, to the book The Man from the Train by Bill and I think Rachel James. It is a fantastic look at what's now known as the Midwest Axe Murders.
Yes.
The idea that you have this individual riding the rails across the U.S., because, of course, this was, pre-interstate highway. People were not driving across the country back then. There was a slew of these murders for which nobody was ever successfully prosecuted and convicted. When it comes to the haunting, what fascinates me about Valeska, having spent quite a few nights in that house, is, people say it's haunted by the killer. The killer never died there.
Yeah.
So why would it be? But it's a much scarier narrative. I hope that, the victims are not there. And there are some who believe they are, and there are some who believe they aren't. I'm not entirely sure. But either way, you have this intense kind of emotional trauma at a location like that. It would be remarkable if there wasn't some kind of psychic after echo. But also, I think a lot of what goes on in that location certainly is residual. I think of it as like a psychic scar, if you will.
But once again, like you say, I mean, without wishing to delve into the nuts and bolts of what happened on that case alone is quite terrifying, Richard, regardless, because of who's involved and who died. I think when you look at, as you say, these strange axe murders, it was almost like an epidemic that was breaking out for some reason. And it's not the first case where trains have been involved for criminals to hop over. I mean, obviously there was a very famous Mexican serial killer who kept jumping on the boxcars and just jumping over the American border, killing people and then going back to Mexico until he was eventually caught. So it still happens. And so you sometimes wonder, back in those days, obviously people could travel wherever they wanted and just turn up in a random town, hang around for a bit and just do what they wanted to do and then just bugger off. And so we sometimes, I think, try to prescribe paranormal explanations for heinous crimes. As you say, sometimes it's almost as if people are putting that forward as an excuse or a reason, rather than dealing with the actual horrific crimes that are being committed on people.
And again, I think you do the victims a disservice, right?
Yes.
You don't need to introduce the paranormal in many of these cases. You simply have a deranged individual performing atrocities, which there are countless cases. But demons have been scapegoats throughout human history.
Yes.
From the earliest humans, they gave us a way to understand, the tragedy of a child dying in infancy, an infant death. A demon smothered them in the night. Far more comfortable, I hate to use that word, to believe that than to think that this could randomly happen to your other children.
Yes.
We've used demons, humanity has used demons to explain pestilence and famine and plague and fire and flood and disaster and murder and all this kind of stuff. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think that it is far more palatable to think that these agents of chaos and darkness are out there working in our lives than it is to consider the possibility that maybe this is a universe in which there is no grand scheme of things, there is nobody at the wheel, and that randomly bad things happen to good people in the same way that good things happen to bad people and vice versa, right?
Absolutely. Criminals can still win the lottery, Richard.
Yeah, it's the randomness that's terrifying. And I think we, as a part of the basic human psychological makeup, is we want people to get what they deserve. And we always think we don't deserve bad fortune.
Yes.
Which is true. Nobody deserves to lose a child.
No.
Nobody deserves to get cancer, in my opinion. You know, but these things do happen.
Yes.
And I think demons have been a handy black box for us to help pin that blame on in the past.
For me, it's very interesting. You can draw parallels with the belief in changelings from Ireland, Richard, which were often put forward in very similar explanations for children who suffered from certain conditions or people who had mental health crises. I mean, the Bridget Cleary case is a prime example of one of those cases that when you discover it, you think, well, this must have happened 300 years ago, not this century or last century. Sorry, there I am. I'm in a time machine. And when you read that book, it is shocking how prevalent these kind of old beliefs were still sort of dotting about in Ireland at the time. And who's to say that there aren't people who still believe that? Because especially when it comes to the Fae and how that's kind of had a sort of renaissance in regards to the belief systems and the people that are interested in that particular subject, the changeling is a very sort of similar kind of beast, as it were, Richard, that is often put forward as an explanation for all kinds of maladies that would affect people.
Absolutely. And I think the reason that demons have this modern day kind of, apart from Hollywood and from television, is the idea that you can defend yourself from them. And the church has done a great job of self-promoting and saying, you know, fear not, we've got exorcisms, we've got this ritual, we can and we will protect you if necessary. You know, you can do something about that. You can forewarn, you can forearm yourself. Whereas there's nothing you can really do to bulletproof yourself against random chance. You know, I
suppose one of the interesting aspects was speaking with people who have been through an exorcism, Richard, as well. How that kind of would give you an insight, as we were saying earlier on. Sometimes with these kind of things, I mean, I remember speaking with Dr. Carl Cooper, and we were talking about people who had lost someone, and we were talking about people using mediums. And he was quite surprisingly positive about it, that once again, as we were saying about the placebo effect, or if it helps, as daft as it sounds, then go for it within reason, that for some people it's what they need because it helps them deal with grief. And therefore, whether you put any stock in it, it's not what matters to you. It's what matters to the person who's seeking those answers. And you would suggest that perhaps this is a similar kind of thing.
You know, I'm a big fan of Dr. Cooper. I've only met him once at an event. He was very engaging, very gracious, and a great man. I agree with Dr. Cooper, and I'm sure he would agree with the caveat I'm about to throw on what he says, as long as it doesn't extend into exploitation. So if a medium if somebody goes to a medium that is bereaved and they achieve comfort, that's great. If they are bilked of tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds or dollars.
Yeah.
And, you know, the medium, then you're looking at the medium treating them as a mark. And this is what's so outraged Houdini on his quest against fake mediums, right? He was not just upset at the idea that this was fraud, but that it was fraud which fleeced people who were vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a reason also Britain used to have a Fraudulent Mediums Act.
Yeah.
So my point of view is, yes, as a placebo, I have no issue at all with someone who wants to believe anything like that at all, or go to a medium until they are being bled dry by. And there are very ethical mediums out there. I'm lucky enough to call several of them my friends.
Yes.
You know, I don't know how genuine they are. I've seen them do things which I cannot explain and have access to information which they should not have been able to have. I don't know how that process works. I only have their word for it. But any that I've ever worked with will not take sums of money from the bereaved to do this. I just think it's crossing a line, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting. I was watching a documentary series recently, and one of the episodes was focusing on the ghost scam that the LAPD got involved in that was going on in Chinatown, Richard, where people were being marked, and it was usually old women who couldn't speak English very well, who were being targeted by an international syndicate of fraudsters. And they were basically being told to go home, collect all their possessions, come to this special room, put all their things in a bag. They perform a ceremony. They give them the bag back, but they weren't allowed to open it till they got home. And they were being robbed of jewels and money, cards and all sorts. And they ended up by accident catching somebody doing the mark when they'd gone to a location with someone who'd been scammed. and they were waiting for them to turn up. But at the same time, they spotted that they were doing the same thing to somebody else, so they were able to capture them. And it turned out to be an international syndicate that was running out of China.
Really? I had no idea about that.
I'll see if I can send you something for you to have a look at when you get a chance. It's a very interesting case because I wasn't aware. It's happened here in the UK. It's happened in Hong Kong is a prime site for it. Australia, wherever you've got a large Chinese population or a Chinatown, these people tend to go to pick on the people who still hold the old beliefs. And it was really interesting how they were using the supernatural as a cover for fraud.
That is interesting. And I'm going to have to read about that. It sounds fascinating and awful at the same time.
Exactly. That's what compelled me to keep watching, Richard. I was like, oh my goodness, these poor people. I mean, going through this journey then, Richard, and visiting the places and the locations, would you say that your opinion has changed from what your initial intention was, or do you think that you've come out of it the other side and you still kind of hold that balanced opinion of what you believed before you started this particular journey on this book?
I did not write the book with the intention of changing anybody's mind, either convincing them of the existence of or the non-existence of demons. So I wrote it to try and find answers. 76,000 words in. I think that I am still open to the possibility that demons are real, but I have not become convinced that they are. So I still do not believe in them. I still do not believe in them.
Well, I think sometimes that is the thing, because as with any strange phenomena, Richard, it only takes one case to be real for it to sort of give quality to anything else that's going on. And regardless of whether you were talking about UFOs or hauntings or possession or Bigfoot or whatever, if one of these incidents is real, then that kind of suggests that you can't dismiss everything out of hand after that point.
No, you absolutely can't, and shouldn't anyway. We need that one black swan, right?
Yes.
And I've always said this about skepticism, whether it's ghosts, possession, whatever the phenomenon is. Skeptics have to say, deniers, not skeptics. Deniers have to be right 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be no ghost case, paranormal, haunting, whatever you want to call it. There have to be absolutely zero instances. The minute you have one genuine case, then they are wrong, and that deserves further investigation, research, and attempts to explain it. So that's the way I feel with demons. I would still look at this phenomenon. It's not like because I finished the book and it's out, I've stopped being interested by it, fascinated by it. But I could have honestly doubled the length of this book and talked to twice as many people, given the time.
Yeah.
But my big regret with this book is that I didn't have the time or the budget to go internationally and look at Africa and parts of the world that are not as Western-centric as our own, In fact, maybe I'll get to do that in future, one that takes a more global look at the phenomenon in other cultures. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be interesting to get opinions from Hinduism and Buddhists and Muslims and look at how they view these kind of situations. Well, Richard, as we say, before I let you go, what's next on your agenda? I mean, you're a man who is incredibly busy, whether you're not writing, you're doing your day job, saving people. You're also investigating all the time. You've a love of history. You've discovered a real thirst for writing about certain historical incidents as well. What does the next few months look for you, other than sort of getting frustrated at how many words you've typed in a day?
Tobias Wayland, my friend, and I, who's been on your show, I believe.
Yes.
We just completed our manuscript for a book about Mothman, tentatively titled American Mothman, which looks at the phenomenon in a similar way to the way I looked at demons. That will be out next September. I'm finishing a manuscript for a book on great hauntings, and it is written hopefully in the kind of style of those old gentlemanly ghost hunter kind of books, where it looks at cases throughout history that are regarded, at least by me, as the most interesting, things like Baldy Rectory, the Bell Witch haunting, things like that. That will not be out until next October, I believe it is. In February, I have 2 books coming out. One is already long since completed. That is called Dark Spirits. Looks at the darker side of the paranormal. Visible Ink publishes that in February. And Spectres of Tombstone is my next location-based book, also out in February, and that takes us out to the wild, wild west.
Fabulous. Well, Richard, I know you've got an itinerary that makes most people's eyes water with your speaking engagements on top of everything else. I just want to say thank you so much for fitting me in. It's been far too long. I hope I get a chance to speak to you again, because it's been lovely to speak to you and get your thoughts on a variety of topics and have such a wide-ranging and balanced conversation about most of them.
It was a pleasure, Paul. And I know you guys don't celebrate Thanksgiving on that side of the pond, but happy holidays to they will be upon us fairly quickly, and stay warm, stay safe.
The very same to you. I shall put links to everything in the show notes so people can track you down, and I know it won't be 5 years till we speak again. Thank you, Richard, and you enjoy your Thanksgiving.
Thank you, sir. You have a wonderful day.